Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. When it comes to sharpening planes and chisels, there are as many opinions as there are people making videos, and a lot of it is confusing. What I want to do in this video is explain to you or show you the simplest method to get a result on a piece of hard maple that leaves a surface flawless with minimal time and fuss, and make it something that anybody can do. Stay with me. I'm going to walk you through and hopefully remove the confusion. When it comes to hand tools, anything that has a cutting edge, sharpening literally is the make or break. It's that simple. And this is an art or a technique that for the most part has almost been lost with the advent of power tools. But now that more and more folks are getting involved in hand tools, it's coming back. And there's a lot of information out there on YouTube on various methods and techniques and tools. But as I said, a lot of it can be extremely confusing. So what I want to do is just bring it down to the absolute basics. What is it you're trying to do? You're trying to get an edge on a piece of steel that will cut a piece of wood as easily as possible and leave a surface that can't be improved. So here I've got my 5.5 with a sharp blade in it, piece of eastern maple. With very little effort, I'm pushing that blade through the wood. I'm pulling off a thin shavings, probably measuring less than 1/1000th of an inch. But more importantly, when I run my hand on that piece of wood, it feels perfectly smooth, and my eye or my hand could not see where there could be room for improvement. Now, as long as it didn't take me a fortune to get there or take me all afternoon to sharpen it, this is what I'm looking for. So I want to show you something, show you how little effort is actually required to make this work when it's properly sharpened. Just the weight of the tool is enough to pull off that shaving. So how do you get it there? Well, you kind of have to take a little bit of a organized approach to this, and there are 4 things that we need to take into consideration. The first is the goal, and the goal is to get it sharp enough that with minimal effort, we can push that plane over a piece of wood, whether it's softwood or hardwood, and get a surface behind that, as I mentioned already several times, is perfectly smooth to the point where you can't get it any better to where my hand or my eye is going to be able to tell the difference. Then there's also the technique. What process are we going to use? Are we going to use a jig? Are we going to do it by hand? Whatever. What is the process of actually manipulating that steel to get this kind of an edge? Third is the medium. What are we going to use to sharpen it? Not just going to rub it on the sidewalk. We've got to actually use something that has been prepared that will treat modern steel and allow it to cut fast enough and fine enough that we can get this kind of result. And then, of course, the fourth one is, when are we done? When do we get to a point where we say any more time we put in is not getting anything back to us because we've already taken the wood to a point where it is as high a finish as you're going to be able to get without putting a microscope on it to see room for improvement. All right, let's talk about sharpening goal. This is mine. I want to get these tools, I'm going to talk about chisels and planes, to cut that wood to a point where I can't improve the surface. Now, I've already done the plane. I'm going to do it again just because I think there's time for repetition. I'm going to now work on a chisel. I've got a piece of northern white pine. Now, the first thing you may say is, well, that's easy to cut. Well, actually, a chisel that will chop through walnut and maple satisfactorily may actually just break the fibers in pine. You have to have it really sharp in order to cut through something soft like pine or basswood without having it crush the fibers. So I'll take that edge, and with very little effort, which means I get lots of control, it will peel through there, and you can tell by the color, it leaves a nice surface. And if you're just in there and run your finger on that, it's nice and smooth. But most importantly, because it's easy to do, it allows me lots of control. And I'm not having to grunt and groan and possibly slip and have this thing go flying out the other end. Sharpness and control are tied together, and I'm a fanatic when it comes to sharpening because I want that control that will enable me to do the very best job I can. So that's my goal with the chisel. I showed you this once with the plane. We'll do it again. A little wax to reduce the friction. Cutting a piece of hard maple. In fact, let's turn this around and try the end grain on that same piece of maple. Now, first thing I'm going to do is just cut a little chamfer on the back side, which just means I won't end up blowing out the fibers. I'll use my block plane to do that. Keep that down low. Now, this is not very flat, so it may take me a bit to get that on one plane, no pun intended. Now, this is what most folks would consider to be the toughest cut of the edge, the face, and the end. Yet we can peel through this with relative ease and pull off a nice, controlled, uniform thickness shaving on the end grain of this maple and leave a nice surface. Now I'll go back and I'll just peel one off the edge. I typically have the blade exposed a little bit more on the end grain, so I'll pull that back in a bit. Almost effortless. It just sails through that, leaving a perfect surface behind. That's my goal. Get that blade, whether it's the chisel or the plane, to a point where I don't have to do any additional work. That is ready for a finish. Part of sharpening is also knowing when to resharpen. And as you can see, the shaving is starting to get serrated. There's little cuts in there. So what happens with a freshly sharpened blade, you've got a nice beautiful edge. You can take a thin shaving and it'll all stay intact. As it starts to break down, you're going to get little fractures along the cutting edge, and the first thing that shows up are these little rips in the shaving. Now, to show you how that can be eliminated, if I advance the blade just a little bit, that disappears because I've managed to get down below those little fractures and your shaving is intact again, but you don't have that same finish. Now, Chris Schwartz labeled that working dull, meaning it'll still cut, it'll still perform, but it doesn't give you that perfect finish that you once had. So one of my arguments for learning how to sharpen quickly is so that at any given time you're less than a minute away from going back to that finishing phase, which I call the part that allows you to literally go right from the plane to the finish. You don't have to do anything and you cannot improve that surface. It sometimes helps to put this on a graph and you can grasp it a little bit better. Now, I don't claim this to be scientific at all. This is just from my however many years of use. So here we go. Blade edge retention performance, time of use along the bottom, level of sharpness up here. So let's say we're going to get our blade 100% sharp. And this is where I argue that you can do it in 32 seconds. The blade is such that in order for you to be able to sharpen it, the manufacturer has to make it soft enough that using stones, you can manipulate the edge and create that cutting edge. At the same time, they want it to be as hard as possible so it'll stay as long as possible, but there's a compromise. So here's what happens. You start up here. As soon as you start using the blade, you start to fall off of that, what I call finishing phase, FP. And that doesn't last very long. And then you end up into what Chris Schwartz once labeled working dull. And working dull is that stage in here where it'll still perform, but it's not giving you that flawless surface. And as you get toward the end of this, you end up with dust coming out, and now the blade has gone well beyond where it should have been stopped. You should have stopped and resharpened. This is easy to attain. You learn how to do it. You learn our system, 32 seconds. From the time you take your plane apart, sharpen it and put it back together, it might be a minute. So at any given time, within a minute, you can actually get to a point where you are putting a final finish. What everybody else has to go through multiple grits of sandpaper and dust, you can do it with 2 or 3 swipes of your plane. Also need to understand this, that as you start to use the plane, it's actually going to get shorter. So if you were to look at the edge of the blade, as it dulls, this starts to get rounded over and you literally are shortening your blade. That's the reason why as you plane, you get to a point where the same setting and you're not picking up a shaving anymore, and you've got to advance the blade a little bit more in order to get back in and engage the wood. Now, there are folks that say, well, if you spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you can get an even better edge. Well, I don't agree with that. Because if that were the case, 32 seconds gives me this, 32 minutes feels the same. Why would you why would you put more effort in if you're not getting any kind of a payback? And the other problem is that if it takes 32 minutes to sharpen, or even 5 minutes, people have a tendency to avoid it. And that's what I see most often with new woodworkers, new hand tool woodworkers, is they allow their blade to get out in here somewhere. Now it's going to take a fair bit of time to bring that back. Freehand sharpening, there's one thing you have to remember. Your ability to hold that angle is extremely limited. If you're trying to sit and do that for 2 or 3 minutes, there's no way you're going to be able to. But if you have good stones, they'll cut, they'll do their job. About 10 seconds on each one is all that it really takes. And I know it says 32 seconds, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But the amount of time I actually spend creating either one of those micro bevels is about 10 seconds. So minimize the amount of time to sharpen. That'll get you into this position. And all the extra stuff that you can do and all the fancy measuring is not going to get that blade be higher than 100% sharp. Like I said, this is not terribly scientific. This is just from real world observation. Don't worry about this phase. This is when you're just having to remove a bunch of wood. And my process is always move the wood, get it really close, then come back, quick resharpen, put the finish on. Like I said, in exchange for all that sanding that so many other folks do, you're doing it with a couple of swipes. There's no dust, there's no danger, there's no noise, just a flawless surface. So the Cosman sharpening system, how long has it been in the making? Well, quick little history lesson. This was my first plane. This belonged to my grandfather. I got that from him in the early 1980s, and I used it for just about everything. I have a hawk blade in there. That's a new addition. And I switched, mid-80s, I switched to a number 8 with a corrugated sole. I spent a lot of money having that machine so that it was flawless, and that was thanks to Ian Kirby and an operation that he had back then. And now, and for the last several years, I use a 5.5. And thanks to David Charlesworth, I've been convinced that this is probably, without a doubt, the best overall plane. Now, the sharpening bit, well, it didn't happen overnight. My criteria was I want the very best edge, the absolute best edge. How could you settle for anything less? Next was time. I did not want to spend 15 minutes over there. 15 minutes doesn't sound like long, but if you're in the middle of building something and you're just in that mode and you've got to stop to sharpen, and that's an interruption to the process, can't have 15 minutes. So I needed time. I wanted to really make this quick. Also, when I started teaching other folks, I recognized they're in the same boat. If you've got to stop what you're doing, find a flat spot, get out the jig and all the rest of that stuff that you use that's dirty from the last time, subconsciously, I'm avoiding that, and that's where people end up allowing their blade to get so dull that it's a long process of bringing it back. My third criteria, which I don't really even consider anymore, is the cost. The reason is this. These materials that you're using to sharpen with are going to last you several years. So if you divide that up by the number of days that you get to use it, it's pennies. If it's going to produce the best possible edge in the quickest possible time, you have to factor that into your woodwork and say, well, that's well worth it. I mean, if I quadruple the amount of time I spent, that's taking away from what I'm wanting to do. And then, of course, removing any of the frustration is a big deal as well. So, stopping to sharpen. Remove the lever cap. Take the blade and chip breaker out. Be careful not to bump the edge. Loosen that. Take the chip breaker off. Here's my system. I keep it right here at the end of my bench. I keep it down low so I'm leaning on top of it. Much easier than trying to do it at bench height. And you can go back and watch my video, 32 seconds of sharp, but I'll just do this in what I would call shop time. Feel the burr. One corner followed by the opposite corner, and the Charlesworth ruler trick to finish off. Clean off the moisture. There's no reason to check it. I don't shave my arms anymore. I just put it back in and I'll know right away how it does. Get that within about a 32nd of an inch of the edge. Lock it in tight. Make sure there's no debris on the face of the frog. You want good solid contact. Careful when you assemble that you don't bump anything. Make sure your chip breaker, your yoke and your lateral adjustment lever engage properly. Enough tension so that you can make adjustments, but it won't slide around on you. Get that parallel to the sole. You'll get to a point where you can do that just by eye. Retract the blade. Verify that it's parallel just as it disappears. Make any final adjustments. I always pull the blade all the way in, a little bit of wax to reduce the friction. And then while you're planing, start spinning the adjuster knob. Watch for the first bit of shaving and tell you whether or not the blade is parallel to the sole. A little bit heavy on the left, so just lean on that lateral adjustment lever ever so slightly. A little more blade. And then you start to pull off that perfect shaving and get that surface that you want. Question that I probably get asked more than any other is, how long will the blade stay sharp? And that doesn't really have a definitive answer. If I'm planing a piece of northern white pine, which is relatively soft, easy to plane, and I could probably spend a half an hour and still be getting nice shavings. Now I'm just pulling that number off the top of my head, but there's not a lot of wearing on the cutting edge as a result of that wood. Flawless surface. Move to something like maple. Well, it's obviously a little bit harder. Interestingly enough, I can get a thinner shaving off of maple just because of the nature of the wood. Now I might be able to get 15 minutes, maybe less, just depends. And find, if you do work maple, you'll often find black spots, and those black spots are mineral deposits. And they will literally take the edge off your plane one pass. I avoid those like the plague. Now, if I'm planing something like snakewood, which is extremely hard, of course that's going to take less time to dull the edge, but if you're in a spot where you can resharpen in a minute or less, and you'll have to, that's already skipping over. I had the same setting and I'm already not getting an edge and just getting dust. Difficult hard wood to work. So, depending on the wood, depending on how sharp you got it to begin with, will determine how long it'll last. But no matter what, you have to learn to sharpen so that the very fact it starts to dull, you can go over there and be back here in less than a minute. And then it doesn't matter. You've already got that process done. You have to learn how to sharpen, and freehand's the way to do it. So the next most popular question is, which blade? What steel? What's best? So what I have in front of me represents everything from high carbon steel, powdered metal, cryogenically treated A2 steel, O1, which is oil hardened. There's an old original Stanley. Now, I don't know, and I've been doing this for a while, if it really makes that much of a difference. I would definitely stay away from the thin blades. The old Stanley blades, the fact that they were thin, they would actually flex under the pressure of your fingers, and in preparing the back, they would flex. I just think that the more beef you have in the blade, the better it's going to, easier it's going to be to sharpen, believe it or not. When it comes to the different manufacturers who are producing current steel, I don't know if there's that much of a difference. I would challenge anybody to do it masked and be able to tell. Now this blade was made for me by a friend of mine. I don't think he's alive anymore. And it's extremely hard. In fact, it was so hard in trying to flatten the back, I had to go in with a grinder and just try to lower that part in the middle, so I was only working the perimeter. It took forever. But interestingly enough, when he shipped them to me, there was actually a piece broken off of that blade. So you get above a certain hardness and it becomes brittle. The Rockwell scale is a means of measuring how hard the steel is, and it involves how deep you can push the end of a little bearing under X amount of pressure into the steel. They measure that, and that gives you your determining factor on hardness. 60-62 seems to be the sweet spot for woodworking. Not too brittle, not too soft. You get much below that, for instance, in a saw blade where you want to sharpen it with a file, you're down in the low 50s. You're not going to be able to sharpen one of these blades with a file. It'll just skate right over it. So I am of the opinion today that it's more important learning how to sharpen so that you can do it quickly and efficiently. That's more important than what steel you're using, with the exception of, I don't think the old ones are that much, are really worth restoring. If I had an old plane and I wanted to bring it back to life, first thing I would do is go buy a modern blade. I just don't like dealing with those thin blades, and it has nothing to do with the steel. It's just the fact that the blade is so thin, they're not as solid in the plane, meaning they're going to vibrate more. And when you're actually handling them and working them, they tend to flex on you. And that sounds crazy, but it actually happens. So don't worry about the steel as much as worrying about your technique and getting to the point where you can freehand sharpen quickly and efficiently. Whenever I would do an instruction on sharpening, one of the first things I would do is explain what is sharp. And I recognize that a lot of folks actually didn't know. And that's kind of like being in a race, not knowing what the finish line looks like. How do you know when you get there? So what is sharp when it comes to a plane blade? Well, some of the basics first. This is the primary bevel, and it's typically 25 degrees. But a cutting edge consists of two surfaces, this side and this side. And the edge can only be as good as the lesser of the two, meaning the surface quality. The first thing I want to do is actually explain what we have to touch in order to get a good edge. So if you look at this primary bevel, it's about 5/16 of an inch wide. The only part of it that ever makes contact with the wood is actually on the back side. But again, whatever you're going to do to one side, you have to do to the other. So we can actually do the very minimum up here. It's going to be called a micro bevel. And then on the back, you see this big flat surface where we used to go in and polish all of that, flatten and polish. Only to use right out here, we now employ what's called the Charlesworth ruler trick, which means we just end up doing a little strip right out here at the edge of the blade. It's a less than 1 degree change, so it really does not make any difference in the way the blade performs, other than the fact it saves you a ton of time. Now, I've done this before, but I'm just going to quickly do it and then show you the result on the finished blade so that you can understand what it is. And I'm going to talk to you about how we actually get it to that stage. Okay, this is the first stage of doing the back using the Charlesworth ruler trick, thin steel rule, elevating the blade less than 1 degree. So you can see a polished strip. It doesn't matter that it's wider over here than it is over there. All that matters is any of these scratches you can barely see that come from the factory, you do not want them going all the way out. So this is a 1000 grit edge. Now, just like sanding, I'm going to stop for a minute and explain this. I've got 3 sheets of sandpaper here. I've got a piece of 120 grit, which means that there are abrasive particles that pass through a 1 inch by 1 inch screen that had 120 holes in it. That's how it was sized. And that is going to scratch the wood so that when it's done, the entire surface has 120 grit scratches. Then if you can move up to something like this, which is 180 grit, same idea, only that 1 inch by 1 inch screen now has 180 holes in it, and those particles fall through. That's what's on that paper. It's going to make the scratches a little bit smaller. This one is 600 grit. Same idea, 600 holes on a 1 by 1 screen, very fine abrasive. It's going to make a much smaller grit scratch on the surface of the wood. So the question is real simple. Which is going to give you a better looking surface? The 120, the 180, or the 600? Well, obviously the 600. Well, the same is true with sharpening the steel. What we're doing to actually make this sharper, we cannot change the bevel angle. In other words, if we made it too acute, there just wouldn't be enough metal out there. So the only other option is to take that surface and polish it with finer and finer grits so that the actual scratch pattern is extremely small. And what that does out here on the cutting edge is it makes that radius, and it is a radius under enough magnification, but it makes it smaller and smaller till we get it to a point where it will leave a surface on the wood that by hand and my eye looks and feels very smooth. I want to show you something with a couple pieces of cherry. I like to keep this really simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. I took a piece of cherry and I sliced it on the bandsaw, so it's essentially the same piece of wood, just two different pieces. This surface I polished up to 240 grit sandpaper. You can see what it looks like. This piece was planed with a plain blade that was taken to 16,000 grit. Look at the difference just in the color. There is no finish on this. This is just right off of whatever we use to finish with. Like I said, 240 here. Plain blade at 16,000 grit here. This piece looks alive, looks fantastic, and it feels wonderful. So there is definitely a good argument for having a really fine edge on your plain blade. Now let me finish this process. After I've gone through and created the 1,000 grit back bevel, I'm going to polish that up a little bit further, and I'll take that to a 16,000, and you're going to see the difference in the way that it shines. Think about that piece of cherry when you see it. Yeah. Now, as imperfect as the back is, meaning not being flat, you can see how shiny just a few minutes on the 16,000 grit is. Now, I want to show you that piece of cherry again so that this will resonate. Quick look again. There's the difference that a higher grit is going to provide. I realize one is sanded and one is plain, but it's dramatic. Okay. Now I'm going to do the bevel side and show you how that plays into the whole sharpening process. I'm going to go through. Okay, so here's what the finished blade looks like. There's my polished back that you've already seen, and if you look over here, that's a polished, what we call a tertiary, because after the primary, we did a little secondary bevel a few degrees higher on a 1,000 grit to straighten the edge, and then we polished the leading edge of that with the 16,000. So minimum amount of work to be done. Now I'll show you this because we have to have a finishing stone. Just like the sandpaper on wood, the higher the grit, the better the surface is going to be, but then you take it to a point where you don't get any additional benefit that you can identify. So I've got 4 stones here. And I want this to make sense, so I put the approximate price on them. So you've got a 4,000, a 6,000, an 8,000, and a 16,000. You've got to finish your stone with, you've got to finish your blade with something beyond the 1,000 grit. And these are all going to last about the same amount of time. So if you're doing this as a hobby, you're probably going to get at least 5 years out of one of these stones. You can pay $70 and get your 4,000 grit. You can pay $75 and get your 6,000. You can pay $90 and get your 8,000. So let's really just consider these two. The difference is approximately $40. $40 spread out over 5 years is not even worth thinking about. So you can either finish at 8,000 grit or you can finish at 16,000 grit. You can finish at 240 grit paper or you can go to 600 grit paper. My argument is it doesn't take any longer. I don't spend any more time doing my final edge with the 16,000 than I would with the 8,000. And what do I get for that? What do I get for that? Essentially, extra $40. I get a surface that when you run your hand over it, you can't find any room for improvement. It's fantastic. It's finished. So, all kinds of gadgets to measure sharpness of edge. I tell people, I said, look, what really matters is, what does it do on the wood? Sharpen your blade, put it in a plane, adjust it, take a pass. If you love the surface and you think, this is fantastic, don't go any further. You don't need any of the rest of it. But you do need good stones to get you there. And I argue that the Sharpening 16,000 is the best finishing stone that I've currently found. And what I really like, I didn't mention this, what I really like about the 1,000 grit diamond stone, which is a CBN product on a flat plate. What's nice about this is it doesn't go out of flat, it lasts a very long time, and it cuts really fast. Now, unfortunately, they've not been able to figure out how to take that up beyond about 4,000. I know there's some that sell higher, but I've tried them, and I'm not convinced they're any finer than 4,000 grit. To go to that impressive higher grit, you've got to go into a water stone or a ceramic. The ceramic is the one that takes you up to the 16,000. You can actually go higher than that, but this is where I think the best value lies. Now, the downside is this has to be kept flat. The way these are made, it's a measured particle, in other words, a 16,000 grit particle, held in place by some kind of a bonding agent to keep it all intact. And as you run the tool over it, the bonding agent wears and keeps exposing a fresh layer of cutting particles. That's what keeps the speed up. Well, the problem with the wearing is it takes it out of flat. The good news is if you've got a harder product, like the back side, the 300 grit side of this, you can simply go on there and you'll watch how quick these marks disappear. It only takes a few seconds to bring that back to a nice flat surface. Got to remember to do that. So here's the simple system. 1,000 grit steel plate with a CBN abrasive on it. Cuts really fast, and the reason why that's so important, not only is it because I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time over here, but when you're holding a blade freehand and you're trying to get that edge, I do this a lot, and my ability to maintain that angle is very limited. I can't spend 60 seconds doing it, but I can spend 10. So I find my primary bevel, get up off of the primary bevel just a little bit, 3 or 4 degrees, and I can spend 10 seconds doing these little circles with my wrist and my elbows locked, pivoting from my shoulder, and that'll cut fast enough that in 10 seconds I'm able to detect a slight burr in the backside that tells me that I'm done. The 16,000, which doesn't cut nearly as fast, but once you've already prepared or straightened that edge, when you set that straightened edge down on a flat stone, it makes contact from one corner to the other. And by simply coming up off of that last bevel, which means if I was up 2 or 3 or 4 degrees beyond the primary, as long as I'm a couple of degrees up off of that on this stone, then all I'm really doing is working the very leading edge. And as we showed you on that other stone, it's so small you can hardly see it, but when you take it to the wood, it does the job. Okay, to tie this all together, it's got to be sharp. Your tools work better when they're sharp. They cut easier, less effort. Less effort means you get more control. Regardless of what everything's out there about measuring sharpness of an edge and whatever, what really matters is what does it do on the piece of wood. My personal recommendation, the diamond stone at 1,000 grit to start the process, the 16,000 grit stone as your finishing stone to finish it. The whole thing takes 32 seconds to sharp. We'll leave a link below to that, and you're able to do this. Now, one last thing I want to add in, and that is the convenience part. As I mentioned earlier, if sharpening is a process that's going to take you 10 minutes and you've got to go and gather up all the gear and find a flat spot, you're going to avoid it. So what I purposely do is have my sharpening station right here at the end of my bench that doesn't get used for anything else. It's always set up, it's always ready. I'm never more than a few steps away from a sharp edge, and at the height that I can easily lean over so that I can get farther away from the cutting edge instead of up here on the bench where you're pivoting from your wrist. Down here you can lean over and you can move that pivot point from your wrist up to your shoulder. Makes it so much easier to maintain that angle. Stones want them to cut really fast so that you can get that done while you still have the accuracy. And the end result is you get this beautiful surface. Don't delay, get your sharpening gear, learn a process that you like, get really good at it, get fast at it so that you'll always stay in that finishing phase of the cycle of a cutting edge. Hope this helps. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.